Rafi. It's your show. We are all here already. I guess we will have more participants in a few minutes. That's, people are normally late, even on Zoom. And Raphael, you will introduce yourself better. I will just say that you're from the Technion and you are a chief speaker. And I'm so happy and honored to have you with us tonight. So.
This presentation, I've given it in half an hour, I've given it in 2 hours. Okay, so we can do it more or less or whatever. And my suggestion is that every 5 slides or so, we can stop for clarifications or questions or whatever. But when you are not active, preferably keep your microphone on mute. But if you want to verge in and ask a question, feel like doing it, that's fine with me. Very briefly about myself, I'm an electrical engineer from the Technion. I graduated in 1974, and actually I got my master's degree in 1979. The first 25 years of my career I spent at Intel Israel, and out of that I was for 5 years the general manager of Intel in Israel. That was in the early 80s. I have a lot of things to tell about that, but it's not for this presentation. And then I've been in 4 or 5 different multinational companies. I'm not going to discuss all of them. I just mentioned that the last one, which was until 2014, was Given Imaging. I don't know if you heard about the pill cam, the capsule that is traveling through your intestines and takes pictures. Well, I was the vice president of research and development of that company until it got sold for $1 billion. And then for about 4 years, I've been at the Technion, where I was the manager of the Entrepreneurship Center, which was basically an educational position. Namely, I was responsible for educating the students to become entrepreneurs. That included all sorts of accelerators and competitions and courses and whatever you can think about. And for the past 2.5 years, I've been a researcher at an institute that deals with national strategy and policies, which is in a very broad set of topics related to education, energy, industry, you name it, economy, whatever. So, but this presentation is basically not about myself, naturally, but about the state of Israel. And I will talk a little about why it's being called Startup Nation or High-Tech Nation. Then I have a whole presentation about the semiconductor industry. I'm not sure I'm gonna go into it, maybe only the tip of that iceberg. And then about the Startup Nation and a lot of examples of companies. Okay, so let's get started and see how we go. First of all, I want to mention, if you look at the right side of this slide, there is here the cover of a book called Startup Nation. That book came out slightly over 10 years ago, in the middle of 2009. And for the following year, in 2010, it was most of the year at the top of the bestseller list, both on the Wall Street Journal and on the New York Times. And I would say, if you look at propaganda or at public relations, I believe this book did better for the state of Israel than the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Propaganda together. Namely, it really did wonders for the state of Israel, because until then, everybody, when they talked about Israel, it was all the time military and politics, okay? And it positioned for the first time Israel as something that is worth looking into from a different angle, and that is the angle of economy, of business, of technology, of things that people care about when they don't care about politics and military. Now, when you look at an economy and you ask yourself, okay, is this country a well-being country, or is it a low-income country, or a middle-income country, or high-income country, and so on, etc. The term that people usually use is GDP, gross domestic product, per person per year. Okay, because that is a number that is calibrated sort of between economies. Because if you can compare, China to, let's say, the UK, naturally, China has a bigger economy, but you also need to remember that China has about 15 to 20 times more people than the UK has, okay, or whichever thing you want to compare. So people are used to talk about the standard of living or whatever based on the GDP per person per year. Now, if you look at the state of Israel and you go back 20 years or so, until year 2000, give or take, for about 15 or 20 years, we were, marching time with a GDP of about 15 to 17,000. And there was this feeling that there is some kind of a glass ceiling at $20,000 per person per year that we're not going to cross, because this is where we are, C'est la vie. We are in a developing country with a developing economy, and that's where our reality is. Well, if you look at the numbers in the past 2-3 years, we have crossed the $40,000 per person per year. Namely, in the past 20 years, the economy more than doubled itself. Okay, and when you ask yourself, what did that change? All of it, comes from the high-tech sector. If it weren't for the high-tech sector, we still would have been under 20K. Okay, but due to the high-tech sector, which is now over half of the economy, we are now where we are. Okay, so we sort of call it the locomotive that is pulling the train of the economy. Now, if you notice, the book is called Startup Nation, but I like to call it High-Tech Nation. The reason being, startup is a very interesting phenomenon, and we may discuss it somewhat. But if you look at what really made the change, it's the whole high-tech sector, primarily the more larger companies. Some of them are, traditional companies, some of them are multinational companies, some of them are military companies, but the startups are less than 10% of that phenomenon, and most of it is by the larger companies. Now, now I have here 2 slides that I borrowed from Arthur and Young that show the dynamics. So if you compare Israel to Germany, France, and the UK, okay, so if you go back 18 years ago, okay, it's clear that Israel was far below those economies. Now we are roughly amidst them. By the way, I'm not relating in my whole discussion to year 2020 and the virus and so on. My discussion is more until we enter the virus. I dare not, imagine what would have happened to the state of Israel if it weren't with a high-tech forte, I would say, and with the economy we had when we entered the pandemic period, because then we would have been in deep, deep, deep trouble. I'm talking now economy and social and so on. So we are in better shape than we could have been due to the high tech. But now let's go back to, I'm saying here, over the 15 years that are described here, you see that Israel closed the gap from those very, very well-off countries, France, the UK, and Germany. On the other hand, if you compare us with the Mediterranean countries, namely Greece, Spain, and Italy, we were roughly in the middle of that pack, and now we are way, way above them. Okay, so comparing apples to apples, Israel did much better than the other economies on the term of GDP per person per year. That's just to illustrate that point. But it's not just money. When you compare I'd say the technology competency of a country or of a nation, okay, one of the terms you're using is research papers. And I'm not now talking about papers that are either in the top tier publications or top tier conferences. Well, on a per capita basis, not on absolute numbers, clearly there are more papers being published by Americans and by Germans and by Japanese, okay? But if you compare that to the population, you divide the number of papers, research papers by population, Israel is #1. Same about registered patents, okay? Israel on per capita basis, we're #1, okay? And same about startups, and we're going to talk about that more, okay? Now, when you talk about companies that are listed on NASDAQ, NASDAQ is like a reflection of the technology of, I mean, companies that are big on technology. And now I'm talking not about on per capita, but rather absolute numbers. Clearly, US is #1. If you compare how many companies are traded that are American, it's clearly #1. China is #2, and Israel is #3. Okay, now we're slightly smaller than either the US or China. Namely, this is an interesting thing to notice. And we also had some Nobel Prize winners. This, if you notice in the bottom, it says EY, because I borrowed this slide from Ernst & Young, and it's actually one out of about a dozen slides that list inventions that came out of Israel that everybody is using, and most people are unaware that they really were invented in Israel. So you have here, for example, the memory stick or flash drive or whatever you call that, okay? That was invented by my good friend Dov Moran about 15 years ago. The firewall, you know, we're talking about cybersecurity. The cornerstone of that cybersecurity is what is called a firewall that is being put around the private garden of a company. A company wants to protect its internal network from people coming from the outside. Okay, this firewall was invented and still is being supported worldwide by Check Point. Okay, ICQ, this is something I'm going to discuss later, so bear with me. Voicemail, you know, I mean, when you go back 15 years ago, you would buy a machine that would be called we called it an answering machine or an answering secretary. And currently, I mean, it's a service that is being done automatically on your phone line or on your smartphone, and so on. And this was invented and developed by a Israeli company. Pilkem, this is the one I discussed already, the capsule that is taking photos of your intestines. And Waze, I don't know if you are using Waze or you're using Google Maps. Anyhow, Google acquired Waze about 5 years ago for $1 billion. And in Israel, everybody's using Waze, and also in many European countries, it is the navigation software. So this is just a list of examples of things that were developed in Israel and almost everybody is using. And as I said, there are a dozen other pages of such examples. Multinational companies, I'll not go into details, but currently there are about 350 multinational companies that have their research and development center in Israel. Okay, so actually anybody who is somebody in the industry, from Apple to Yahoo to Google to Microsoft to IBM to Samsung to Huawei, anybody has a design center in Israel. Okay, it is a myth is not necessarily founded, but everybody thinks that if you don't have a design center in Israel, you have a disadvantage. So every such company is, establishing its center in Israel, which is great for us because it gives employment to people and really reinforces our economy. This is a slide. I borrowed that from a friend when we were in a conference in Rio about 7 years ago. And that showed that when you look at the ecosystem, okay, which means the total environment, which includes the industry, the academia, the support from the government, all the professional offices, everything, then Tel Aviv, which represents Israel, is #2 after the Silicon Valley, and well ahead of London or Paris or Boston. Well, I would say that #2 is way high there, But when I looked at the number about several years afterwards, okay, it showed Tel Aviv in number 5. I don't know whether we are number 5 or even number 8 or 9. The fact that we are in the top 10 is very, very impressive. Okay, this one now, bear with me. I hope it will play. Usually it does. With Zoom, I don't know. This was actually a movie that was a propaganda movie, actually, that was done for Israel's 70th anniversary. Namely, it was done about 2 years ago. It sounds like propaganda, but all the facts in it are valid, true facts. So try to listen for the next couple of minutes, assuming that it works. Does it work? Can you see it?
Israel is the 100th.
Okay.
Yes, it's working.
It has about 1/1000th of the world's population. It's only 70 years old, smaller than New Jersey, surrounded by enemies, under constant threat of survival, and possesses few natural resources. And yet, Israel is the only country in history to have revived an unspoken language. Since its founding, Israel has won the second highest number of Nobel Prizes per capita. Although the Jewish people are only 0.2% of the world population, Jews have received 22% of Nobel Prizes, constituting an inexplicable 11,250% above the statistical probability. Israel is the only country that entered the 21st century with a net gain in its number of trees. Even more remarkable, in an area that's mainly desert. Over 90% of Israeli homes use solar energy for hot water, the highest percentage of any country. Israeli companies are building the largest solar energy production facility in the world. Israel operates the world's largest desalination plant and is the #1 country providing usable water from seawater. Israel's scientific research institutions are ranked 3rd in the world and are ranked 2 in space sciences. Israel leads the world with medical patents and has revolutionized modern medicine. Oramed is changing the diabetes therapeutic paradigm by delivering insulin in a pill. Walk's exoskeleton allows paraplegics to walk. Orcam allows blind people to virtually see. Israel has more patents registered in the US than Russia, India, and China combined, who have 300 times Israel's population. Israel's innovations have improved the way we work, print, drive, read, eat, drink, talk, exercise, and even play. Israel is the only liberal democracy in the Middle East, and its 3rd largest party is often the Arab Party. Israel has provided humanitarian aid and rescue services to over 140 countries, even to some that refuse to recognize it, like Syria and Lebanon. Israel is the 3rd most educated country in the world, according to the OECD. Israel has the world's 2nd highest number of new books per capita. Israel has the 3rd highest rate of entrepreneurship among women in the world. And in 1969, Israel elected Golda Meir, the 2nd female head of state in modern history. In proportion to its population, Israel has the largest number of high-tech startup companies in the world. In absolute numbers, Israel has more startups than any other country except the US and China. Israel is the only country whose indigenous population returned to its native land after 2,000 years of forced exile. There are 26 official Muslim states in the world and 18 official Christian states, but there is only one Jewish state. Israel, a small place making a big difference.
As I said, this is a propaganda movie, but all the facts in it are accurate. I'll just mention 2 things. One is that on the Nobel Prizes this year, also about, I believe, either 4 or 5 of the recipients are Jewish. I mean, if you look at the proportion, this is not the state of Israel, and I'm talking about Jewish, then, I mean, it's striking that about 20% of all recipients of Nobel Prize since its inception in the beginning of the last century were Jewish, 20%, when we are only 0.2%, namely 100 times less of the world population. So this is a striking, something that goes beyond any statistics. The other thing, they mentioned that the Arab Party is the third largest party in the parliament, and that's true also since the last election. So this is reflecting reality. Let me stop here for a minute or two for questions that you may have, and then we'll proceed.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Rafi, there is a question which was asked quite long ago, and that's what about the annual income of the low-skilled population? Can you see it on chat?
I don't see chat, and I prefer to focus on my presentation. But there is a wide range of income. Namely, GDP doesn't talk about income; it talks about the size of the economy. But it depends. I would say that the low-income people, I'd say on the average, have something like between $1,000 and $1,500 per month income, which is substantially lower than the average income, but still is much, much higher than anybody in the Middle East or in any of the developing countries. And the other thing to notice is that due to the high-tech sector and due to the taxes being paid and so on, the government budget has more than doubled in the past 20 years, which means we have much, much more funding for education, for health, for welfare, and so on. So also, those people whose income is not that great, at least they get support from the systems that are funded by the government budget. Any further questions before we proceed? Okay, so let's proceed. And again, if you have questions later on, okay, I'll skip that. I mean, there.
I have one question.
Yes.
Given the land mass and population and your facilities that you have, what are the biggest challenges moving forward for the high-tech industry?
For the high-tech industry, clearly one of the biggest is workforce, okay? Because the more it expands, the more it needs educated people, and there is a gap between some of the people's ability and what the high-tech industry really needs. That's one challenge. The other challenge, which is always there, is the fact that all our markets are very remote. Okay, I mean, we cannot sell to our neighbors, and by the way, this is also a good thing because of that, anybody who starts a company, okay, cannot talk about the local market. They always immediately think, okay, how am I going to penetrate the US or Europe or Asia? So it is part of their strategy, but still it's a challenge because it's a distance, and clearly you'd rather have local or close, customers than having to travel across the ocean to reach them. The other interesting thing is, and that's something that the whole of Europe is experiencing as well, is the fact that Asia is coming up as a very interesting challenge because of the low cost of labor, and they're very diligent and they're very, very effective. So, and I'm not talking just about China, I'm talking about Vietnam, Bangladesh, Indonesia, other countries, India. They're doing very, very interesting moves, and it's challenging. So you all the time need to work hard in order to stay ahead of the game. So these are challenges that are there. Hopefully, we will have more and more innovative products and innovative ideas coming from the younger generation to keep us ahead over the years. Okay, so I have here 2 or 3 pages which I'm going to skip with more and more things that Israel is doing well. Okay, now, when you look about investing in the future, one of the indicators is the investment of the country in research and development. So the OECD, which is the reflection of the top 40 rich countries, if you would like, is roughly at 2.3% of its GDP or of its economy. Israel is double that with 4.3% and is ahead of everybody. So at least as far as investing in research and development, we are really doing well on investing in the future. Okay, I'll skip that. Also, there is a very strong venture capital activity. We are, at the top there with the amount of or the percent of GDP that is being put into the economical activity, let's put it. One interesting indicator is, looking at what is called exits. I guess most of you know what an exit means. Exit means one of two things. Either that somebody buys you, which means if they pay, let's say, $1 billion for you, it means they think you are worth that $1 billion. Or you go public, which is called an IPO, which is going on the market with your shares, which again is an indication of what you are worth. Okay, if you have 1 million shares and each share is worth $100, and people buy that, then you're worth $100 million. Okay, so it's a clear valuation of what you as a company is worth. Now, the numbers you see here are until 2014. In the next slide, you're going to see what happened afterwards. But basically, and I've seen that happening across the years, each and every year, we are having 100 exits. Actually, I saw the statistics for the last 5 years. I saw that yesterday. Okay, in the past 5 years, we had 494 exits, which means if you round that to 500, it's exactly 100 exits every year. So this phenomenon continues, and the money raised is always somewhere around $5 or $6 billion every year. Now there are exceptional years, and you don't see that here. But for example, when Intel bought Mobileye, when Mobileye was bought for $13 million, so this one event by itself, was more than double the whole annual average. Okay, so you see here what happened until 2017, same numbers kind of, and so on. I'm not going to belabor you with all that. Here I only listed the top 8 or 7, actually it's 8, exits or acquisitions that happened. I mentioned already Mobileye. Mellanox was acquired about 3 or 4 months ago by NVIDIA for almost $7.5 billion. Okay, NDS, a company that I used to work for, was bought by Cisco for $5 billion, and so on. So there are some very, very impressive deals that happened in the past, let's say, 5 to 10 years. Okay, I'm going to skip that. Okay, again, let me stop for questions here, and then I will go into a few examples of things, and also so far I explained the phenomena. I didn't explain how it happened or why it happened. So any further questions?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. So there is one question. Speaking of the skilled workforce, the military is increasingly using people with disabilities. Is high tech using people with disabilities?
Yes, actually, and now, by the way, disabilities has a whole range. I mean, it depends if you are, let's say, paralyzed or if you are retarded. There are two different aspects. Okay, so I've been working with a lot of people that had disabilities, even in my early days at Intel. I'm talking now about 30 years ago. Okay, we had a few deaf people. We had a few people with, actually, when I wanted to give an imaging, the manager of the hardware section was without 2 legs, okay, and so on. Yes, also one of the companies that was mentioned already in the movie, and I'm going to mention later on, Rewalk, was initiated by Amit Gopher, who is paralyzed from his neck down. Now, I'll expand on that question, because it's not just a matter of being people who are handicapped or whatever. Also, let's talk about Arabs, okay? Or let's talk about, very Orthodox people and so on. Our approach at high tech, I did it in all 5 companies that I worked, and I know that most of my colleagues do the same, okay? We could care less about what your background is or whatever. We could care about what you can do. If you are a brilliant engineer, or if you are a person who brings value as far as his or her competency, okay, we would love having you, okay? And we expect you to perform as the others. And if you need to accommodate certain things that you cannot do that others can do, we are going to accommodate because you bring value. That's our business approach, and it's been doing wonders to us. I was the first person who hired Arabs into Intel, and that goes back to 1980, okay, namely over 40 years ago, okay? Today, there are, I think, out of the 3,500 engineers that Intel is employing today, I believe that about 10% of them are Arabs, okay? Because, I mean, there is no security issue with engineers at Intel, and there's no reason why they couldn't, perform like anybody else, as long as they are good, as long as they are good engineers. By the way, one of those engineers who used to work at Intel, Johnny Sruji, he is now the senior vice president of Apple and is responsible for all products development worldwide of Apple. He is not, I think, something like number 2 or number 3 at Apple. And he started as an engineer at Intel, and he's Arab. Okay, so my point is that at least the high-tech sector, okay, has no prejudice against any, deficiency, as long as you could contribute effectively to the development of the products or to their performance. Okay, let me proceed
wait,
now.
there is another question.
Yes.
Rega, we have another question.
Yes.
Yeah, so before question, we have a suggestion that the state of Israel should offer free or subsidized education for American Jews, because the universities here are not friendly to those kids, and the education in Israel is better anyway. So still the MIT stand for Harvard kids. Okay, so this is a suggestion. And the question is, how much of this success is because of the Russian immigration?
Okay, I'm going to defer that answer to about 10 minutes, and I'm going to get to it in a context that I'll explain later on. Okay, but I would say we were blessed that we had the Russian immigration, and most of those people came with a very good education. Unfortunately, some of them couldn't use it. For example, teachers, couldn't teach because of the language barrier, okay? Or there were other musicians, okay? We had many more musicians than all our orchestras could, accommodate, and so on. So not everybody could use their profession effectively, but as far as technologists, engineers, scientists, technicians, most of them were absorbed very effectively into our economy. Okay, let me, I'll give you 2 examples to tell the background, and then I'll go and generalize. Now, this one is a whole hour presentation. I'm not going to go into it. I'm going to give you only a glimpse at it. So one thing you need to know, that almost everything that we are discussing in Israel is somehow related to a war, okay? It started with our independence war back in 1948, and there the beginning was very, very bad. Namely, the country was in a war for about a year, and at the end of it, most of the economy was broke, and within the next 3 or 4 years, they had to absorb roughly twice the population that was there. They had 1,600,000 people in the country, and 600,000, and over a million, almost 1.5 million immigrated into Israel in the following 3 or 4 years. Some of them fled the Arab countries or Muslim countries, and some of them were refugees from the Holocaust from Europe. So that's one interesting starting point, which was very, very, very difficult. Okay, I was born then, roughly, so I didn't experience much of it. By the time that I grew up, things already, evened up more reasonably. Okay, now back in 1956, actually, that's a typo. 1956, there was what was called the Sinai Campaign, and there Israel collaborated with France and the UK. Okay, and we conquered the whole of the Sinai Peninsula. I'm not going to go into details on that. Interestingly enough, 11 years later, in 1967, we had what is called the Six-Day War, and there we went by ourselves. Now, this pissed off very much Charles de Gaulle, who was the president of France, and he decided to boycott the state of Israel. Okay, and that had a lot of ramifications, especially, what the problem was that our airplanes that did actually win the war in '67 were all French airplanes, the Mirage planes, and suddenly we were on those planes without ability to have, supplies or spare parts for them, and so on. So it caused several things. One is they founded in Beit Shemesh a factory for engines. The other one was, when you look at an airplane that is in combat, it needs to identify the other airplane from very, very far distance. We're talking about several kilometers. And to do that, you need solid state detectors, usually cooled detectors. And I'm not going to belabor you in the technology that is in there, gallium arsenide, indium antimonide, in those materials. So we were, at a place where we couldn't get those. And then Professor Itzhaki Dron, okay, who I had the pleasure of studying by him slightly after that, he approached the armament authorities and the government and said, give me 3 years, give me the budget, and you will have all the detectors that you need. And they did that. And in the late 60s, he built a lab in the Technion that focused on those materials and focused on semiconductor, and was able to supply, as of 1971 or 72, all the needs of the Israeli Air Force and more. Now, why is that important? When I joined the Technion, okay, I had no idea what a semiconductor is or anything. But when I came to my 3rd and 4th year, that was already one of the topics that is being offered for studies, okay? And we were, several tens of students that studied that, okay? Why is that important? Because back in 1974, and I'm not going to belabor you with all the details, Intel decided that they need to go somewhere else besides California or besides Silicon Valley. And Dov Froman, who was an engineer there, convinced the management that they should go to Israel, and not just to Israel, but specifically to Haifa, because it's close to the Technion, and because in the Technion there is this lab of semiconductors. So there were tens of students that studied semiconductor and could readily be, workforce that could design chips for Intel. If it were not for that, we call it necessity is mother of invention. If it were not for the boycott of the French, probably we would not have had a semiconductor lab in the Technion, and we would not have had this expertise. And I don't know if at all Intel would have come to Israel. So out of this chain of events, okay, that nobody could foresee where it's leading, okay, eventually Israel built a semiconductor industry that is about 20% of our overall economy. And again, I have a whole presentation on that I'm not going to, this is Dov Froman, that I'm not going to belabor you with. I'll skip on. Okay, this is, here you see the people on the roof. These were the 6 first employees of Intel in Israel. I'm one of them. I was lucky to be one of them back in 1974. By the way, all the surrounding here are a garage. This is a very shabby area. This is how Intel started at the time. I'm not going to labor you with that. Okay, this was our second place that we were, and again, you can see that it's not a high-tech area, you know, with the cows in the background and so on. Okay. Okay, I'll skip all that. So I'll only tell you that today Intel employs about 15,000 employees in Israel and another 10,000 subcontractors or people who are employed by subcontractors. So the livelihood of 25,000 families hinges on being employed by Intel, and they are exporting over $5 billion a year. So it's a huge, huge operation. Furthermore, anybody who is in the semiconductor industry in Israel, regardless of the company they are in, all those companies were established and are managed by people who grew up at Intel. So Intel is responsible, I would say, for those 20%. Okay. Now I'll tell you the other story, and it will relate to this Jewish immigration from Russia. So, as you mentioned, or let me start this way. Back in 1989, 1990, there was the, the collapse of the iron, how you call it, curtain. Okay, namely, the USSR collapsed. The Berlin Wall was, broken, and so on. And within the following 5 years, over 1 million Jews emigrated from Russia or from the ex-USSR to Israel. Now, in all fairness, we didn't know what to do with many of them because really they overwhelmed us with their education and so on. And then somebody came with an idea. I don't know who that person was. Okay, at the time it was revolutionary. Today it's self-evident. That idea is what we call today incubators. Okay, so within a year or so, they established about 50 incubators. An incubator was actually a floor of offices, where in each office you put 2 or 3 engineers, scientists, technicians, and so on. And you gave them, let's say, a salary for a year or two. You gave them, computers or lab equipment or whatever they needed. And you told them, go do your own thing, okay? Namely, invent something, maybe of an idea that you brought with you from Russia or some other new things. So over those 5 years, from 1990 to 1995, I'd say close to 500 startups were born in the infrastructure of those incubators. Now, usually I ask for guesses how many of those were successful. Okay, actually, I'll let you guess. As I said, there were about 500 startups that started. Okay, so if somebody wants to guess, feel free for 10 seconds, and then I'll give you the right answer.
20%.
Okay, any other number?
Yeah, we have a number of 497.
Okay. Any other number?
200.
Okay, so let me tell you, the right answer is one company. Okay, actually, all of those were failures except for one company called Medinol, which is very successful to this day. I guess you know what a stent is. A stent is what you put in the arteries to avoid clogging. Okay, so they invented the stent. It was a Russian Jew that invented it, and there were the Richter family that are managing this company to this day that joined him and made a company out of that. This company was extremely successful, but all other 499 were failures. Okay, but out of that came the infrastructure of having those offices ready, and the model of incubator, as well as there was also a fund that was established by the government to give, small money. If you needed 20 or 30 or $40,000 to, to write a patent or to do an experiment or whatever, you had this framework in place. Now, why is that important? Because then in 1995, something else happened, which was a revolutionary in the world. I guess most of you are old enough to remember that. I remember it the day that for the first time some friend showed me the internet, and I pressed the key and I could get within a fraction of a second to the Library of Congress or to the Museum of the Louvre or to any other place around the world and so on. For me, it was mind-blowing. I mean, to this day, I'm blown off by the the marvels of the internet. But at the time, I'm talking about the mid-90s, okay, it suddenly, burst, and the whole, population of the world got exposed to it, but there were no tools for it. There was no Google or no WhatsApp and no Facebook and no Instagram, nothing, okay? So anybody who could do something that would use effectively this immediately got attention. And for young engineers, actually not engineers, students from the Tel Aviv University, okay, worked for 2 months and they developed a tool, okay, and they started marketing it. And over 6 months, they got over 20 million users for it, okay? By the way, they gave it away for free. So it wasn't a business as is. And then AOL, which I think most of you heard about it, AOL acquired this company. The company was called Mirabilis, okay? And they bought it for $400 million, okay? The tool, by the way, is called Chat, okay? And it's still being used today by almost everybody. It's like a WhatsApp, very, very similar, okay? But, today, when you look, we have a $400 million exit every other week. It barely makes the news, maybe in the economic section. It's no big deal. At the time, it was on the front page of every newspaper for a few days, okay? $400 million for 4 students who worked for 2 months. Okay, that was mind-blowing. And then, Israelis said, hey, these guys are no smarter than me. If they could do it, I could do it as well. And what we call like mushrooms after the rain, there were hundreds of such ICQs were born almost overnight. And that started this ball rolling, okay? Namely, from then on, okay, we had every year hundreds and hundreds of teams trying to do this, wonder of a startup. Now, so let me explain now the economy of this thing. For some reason, okay, there is the rule of big numbers that says that if you have 100 companies, 100 startups starting, okay, then 95 of them are going to be failures and 5 are going to succeed. So almost always, roughly 5% of the companies that start are going to be successful, 95% are going to be failures. Now, if I knew which ones are going to be successful, namely I would invest in them and I would have been a billionaire, but I'm not. Okay, so it's not easy to tell which one is going to be, but the rule of big numbers now works. So if 100 start, then 2 years later, 3 years later, okay, 5 survive and usually succeed big time. Okay, now, if you compare Israel to any other countries, okay, then Israel should have had every year about 300 to 350 companies starting. But Israelis like Israelis, there are about 2,000 starting every year, okay? Namely, about 5 or 6 times their fair share, okay? And if you have 2,000 starting, then as we've seen in the numbers, 100 of them are going to be successful 3 or 4 years later. So Israel has got about 5 to 6 times more startups starting and more startups succeeding than any other country per capita. And that's basically the secret recipe, if you would like. Now, it's not because Israel is smarter, okay? I bet that if you compare, you know, an IQ or any other, curve or measure, the Israeli graduates of the universities versus those of France or those of Argentina or those of India, you know, the bell shape would be very much the same, okay? Namely, there are very, very smart guys, there are a lot of people in the middle, and there are some not so smart ones, okay, in every country, including in Israel, okay? So this is not the secret. The secret is the fact that we have tremendously more entrepreneurs in Israel than any other country. And when you ask yourself why, the answer is that it's a combination of things. But A, they think they know better. Okay, you know, I have 5 grandchildren. The youngest one is only 3 months old, so I'm not counting for this discussion. The one above him is now 6 years old. When he was 2 years old, okay, he already was, you know, commanding the family. He knew better than anybody what is right and what is wrong. And when he wanted something, he would insist on it. And if mother said no, he goes to father. If father says no, he goes to the grandmother. He would get what he wants. Okay, and also he was unafraid of failure. If people were telling him, you know, it's dangerous for you to touch electricity or fire or to go down this swing or whatever it is, he needs to know for himself. If he learns that it's difficult for them, that's fine, but you cannot tell him that he can go wrong, okay? So in Israel, failure is not a bad thing, okay? In Israel, failure means experience. And a good friend of mine told me, I'd rather hire somebody who started 5 things and failed 5 things than somebody who never started, okay? Which is different than many other cultures, okay? So basically the message here is there's something in the Israeli culture which makes them dare more, makes them try more, and fail more, okay? So we have many, many more startups in Israel than in any other country because of that spirit, because of that chutzpah, because whatever you call that. There are other reasons, you know, you can talk about the military service and the fact that teamwork is very much, ingrained into people, or that the officer training is building very good managers. And so I can go many, many other reasons. But the primary reason is that our culture is, you know, very much going into trying things, starting things, and also failing things many times, doesn't matter. And because we try it more, we also succeed more. And this is basically the secret of this phenomenon that is called Startup Nation or High-Tech Nation. Okay, now I have a whole section, which I'm not sure we have the time to go into, but it's up to you. Okay, it may take about 20 minutes, where I give examples of companies that exemplify the message. The question is, this is up to you, whether you want us to go, you want me to go through that or not.
Continue, please. Continue, please.
Yeah.
Okay.
Rafi,
So let's,
Rafi?
if there are questions, let's have 2 minutes for questions and then we'll proceed.
Yeah, Rafi.
Yes.
Right. Okay. So, Rafi, I would appreciate if, okay, so let's do the following. Since I know that some people need to go and others are willing to listen forever. So, will you please answer the questions, and then I will make a short announcement for next week. And then, you know, I'm willing to listen to you as long as you speak. Okay. So let's start with the questions. Question number 1 was, okay, what is the impact of military service on entrepreneur behavior? Well, this is something you sort of answered, right? Or you
I basically answered that. I mean, there are many aspects, but the 2 most glaring one is the fact that those people spend 3 years, you know, 24 hours, 7 days a week together, fighting together, eating together, living together, everything. So in a sense, teamwork becomes a natural trait for them. And the second aspect is the fact that because of the excellent, not just officer training, but officer experience, you know, you take those 20-year-old kids and you put them in charge of 20 young or 20 or 30 young 18 years old people, and you are responsible for them on everything, including their lives. You know, when you go into combat, you know, if you make mistakes, it may cost the lives of those people, and so on. So decision making, charisma, anything that you can think about, they get live training on that, and that makes them much, much better managers later on. Yes.
All right. Another question is how to explain Israel's low math and science scores in schools compared to what Israel is doing in high tech? This is a good question.
You need to understand that it's very bimodal. If you would take the secular Jewish population, which is about 2/3 of the population, our numbers are roughly in the middle of Europe. Namely, we're in good shape. But because the Arab population, and especially the Jewish Orthodox people, who do not study mathematics, do not study sciences, do not study English, okay, then the scores are very, 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 very low. As a result, we have this bimodal partitioning. Unfortunately, it's a big problem, and it's something that hopefully over time we are going to close that gap, but currently it reflects where we are. The fact is that, you know, the results are the people who do make it to the university, which are like the top half of the population, are doing very, very well.
Okay, thanks. Now, over how long a time should a startup survive to be called a success?
Okay, that's an interesting one. Actually, I have a whole presentation that my good friend, Professor Shlomo Meital, did on, you know, looking at the scene of companies. It turns out that there is a very high percentage, let's call about 1/3 of the companies that are zombies, namely living dead. These are companies that survive, they somehow burn money every time, but they're not going to be successful eventually, okay? And nobody has the courage to kill them, okay? So this is not success, okay? So to be successful is not measured by duration, but rather by being able to you know, penetrate the market. And usually it's either you have an exit, you know, like the examples that I gave, if you are acquired or you are with an IPO, or if you are privately held, if you are a leader in, let's say Checkpoint, by the way, that's a good example. That's a company that is privately held, it's not traded, but okay, it is, you know, it is the leader in its area, and its sales are several billions of dollars. It's clearly a success, okay? There are not too many of those, okay? So success is measured by the performance, both of the product as well as the company, as far as the investors or as far as its well-being. Okay.
All right. We have two questions which are sort of connected. One is what percentage of the high-tech industry elite are or were women? And the other one is what is the ratio of male-female entrepreneurs? What percentage of the high-tech industry elite are or were women? And what is the ratio of male-female entrepreneurs?
Okay, I don't know the exact numbers. I would guess that about 20% are female and 80% are male. Also, when it comes to, you know, C-level executives, namely chief marketing officer, chief operation officer, chief research and development officer, and so on, usually about somewhere about between 20 and 30% are ladies and the other are male. I wish there were more ladies in that. The good news is that when you look at higher education today, I look at the Technion. When I studied, okay, in electrical engineering, we had 300 boys and 5 girls. Okay, today it's roughly 50-50, or maybe 45-55%. And interestingly enough, by the way, in the Arab population, we have more ladies than men. Okay, today at the Technion, it's 60% Arab ladies and 40% Arab boys. Okay, with the Jews, it's roughly the other way around, 60% boys and 40% girls. So today, as far as the high education, I would say we are very close to the being 50-50, and I'm very, very glad of that. It is going to take time until that is going to penetrate to the industry and so on. We also need to remember that still, unfortunately, the tradition is in most cases that when you raise children, more of the burden goes on the mother than on the father. I mean, we have many people where they share 50-50. I have a good friend who actually he is back home with the children, and his wife is actually a very senior manager at Apple in Israel. So there are exceptions, but generally speaking, unfortunately, more of the burden goes on the ladies. So even if, you know, the 50% of the graduates of the Technion are ladies, still it's going to take a long while until it's going to be 50% of the managers in the high tech. But that's the reality.
Sure. Okay, and the last question is intellectual property theft is a concern?
Yes.
Say it again. I didn't understand the question.
Is the intellectual property theft is a concern?
Sure.
האם יש הרבה גנבות של...
I understand. Well, not so much. Actually, by the way, there is a paranoia in the academia. Okay. By the way, not so much of the inventors, but of the officers of the institutes. That because of that, unfortunately, many cases where you have an invention in the academia, it does not make its way to become a successful product because the managers of the university or the lawyers make so many difficulties that eventually the deal doesn't come through. Actually, almost all my friends who are in the industry and leading, many of them are CEOs of companies. When you come to them and you say, hey, there is this idea coming from the university, they tell me, leave me alone from university. I don't want to get close to them because it's going to be years before we resolve all the crossing the T's and dotting the I's on the agreements. And by that time, it's going to be worth nothing. Leave me alone. I don't want to deal with them. So I'm generalizing, but again, this is a problem. Basically speaking, I would say that the things move so fast today in the industry, okay, that you don't have time to copy almost. Namely, if you are there with a good idea, go do it and so on. And by the time you are copied, you are already doing the next thing and so on. I can tell you from Given Imaging, the capsule that we developed, okay, it was copied by Japanese, by Koreans, and by Chinese, okay? We still maintain 90% market share because by the time they built what we had, we already had the next generation and then the next generation. Every time we were 2-3 years ahead of the game, ahead of them with a better product and better service and everything. So I would say it is a concern if you're not careful, but it's not a big deal. Okay.
Okay, so Rafi, thank you for all the answers. So for those of you who wish to leave, thank you for
Julia,
coming and joining it, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation.
Yes, I guess I'm
Yeah.
up. Hi, can I make a comment? This is Barry. Rafi, in 1989, I was working in Philadelphia with a business incubator. And we came to Israel and met with the chief scientist because Israel was the example of incubator to incubators. Really interesting. And we visited many incubators in Israel to try to come back to the United States. The big difference between the United States, at least our area, and Israel was the incubators were supported by the government. And we never had significant government support. So incubators in the United States had to be on their own. It was very difficult to economically to survive as an business incubator.
Okay. By the way, today most incubators are already mostly privately funded. They have some government funding, but most of it is now by the industry. Okay.
Interesting.
Okay. So again, for those of you who wish to go, well, not home, but other businesses, thank you for coming. And I would like to thank Rafi on behalf of all of us for taking the time and telling us the story. And I totally, being Israeli, I totally agree with the reasons he presented for the fact that we are such a high-tech nation. And so before we proceed with Rafi's presentation, as Steve told you before, we have a tour, a Zoom virtual tour from Machon Weizmann Institute, the house of the first president of the State of Israel, Chaim Weizmann. So the president is unique and the house is unique. And I will be watching with you. I will not be there, just this once. I will be in Greece already. I'm not sure where exactly. Hopefully I will have Wi-Fi. So I will be, virtually with you. And then next week we have this amazing presentation about birds who know no boundaries by Professor Yossi Leshem. And then Thursday, it's gonna be a Greece surprise. It will be a live Zoom tour. I don't yet know where from, probably Athens. And then I will be back, and then we have, and then we will have more things to do together.
Just to remind
so,
Julia,
Rafi, we're back to you.
Yeah,
Julia,
Steve
the
wants to say
time on
something.
Thursday's presentation is 2 o'clock, not 1 o'clock.
Yeah, the time, right, same as today.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. By the way, Yossi Leshem is excellent
Okay,
in
Rafi.
birds. I know him. Okay, good. Okay, now I'll show you here very briefly about 30 companies that represent the high-tech scene, each one of them in its own way. Well, Intel Israel, actually I already mentioned it, it's the largest exporter of high-tech in Israel with over $5 billion, and as we said, 15,000 employees and 10,000 contractors, and it's done wonders for the state of Israel, and I hope it will continue doing so. Okay, this is the flash memory, or the memory stick, or whatever you call that. My good friend Dov Moran invented it. It's a whole story how he did it. And his company M Systems was acquired by SanDisk for $1.6 billion about 8 or 9 years ago. This is an interesting something that I saw in Facebook. It basically says that, you know, this little thing saved many, many trees more than Greenpeace. So I like that. I'm going to skip that. I just want to mention, on the hill, on top of the Technion, there is the IBM Research Center, which has over 1,000 scientists, and they are doing wonders, especially in the new field that we have now of data science, data engineering, big data, and so on. Israel was the world leader in color print. It was Cytex and later on also Indigo. So this goes back to the 80s. Then actually when you bought a magazine of Life or Time or a book that had color print and so on, that was usually done with the machines that were built in Israel. Mobileye, we already mentioned. I'll only mention one thing. Amnon Shashua, who is the inventor and the leader, he came to the Technion 5 years ago to give a presentation to our students. And Mobileye is in Jerusalem. And he said, before he started his presentation, you know, I drove now for 2 hours from Jerusalem to Haifa without touching the steering wheel or the brakes or anything. Okay, he had the only car and the only license allowed to do that. Okay, this was already 5 years ago, and he says he said at the time, by year 2022, you know, there are going to be many models that can do autonomous driving. Namely, they are cognizant of, you know, the lights and the lanes and the neighboring cars and everything. It drives a little slower than you would drive, but much, much safer. So it was acquired by Intel for $15.3 billion, which is the biggest exit that we ever had. TowerJazz, this is a company that I used to work for about 5 years. And what they do is wafer fabrication. I don't know if you know, but today about 80 to 90% of the wafers in the world are being, namely for chips, the silicon chips, are being built in the Far East, primarily in Taiwan, TSMC and UMC, as well as in China. Well, Israel has this one company, which is a world leader in what is called specialty foundry, and its sales are also over $1 billion and doing very, very well. Mellanox, this is the company that was acquired by NVIDIA about less than half a year ago for $7.5 billion. What they do is, you know, I don't know if you're familiar with those server farms. These are farms that we do the computations or store information, like Google, Amazon, Microsoft. Those companies are serving what is called, you know, the cloud. Okay, behind the cloud there are those server farms where they keep all the information and do all the processing. Now these computers need to communicate between themselves, and the way they do it is that those slices have communication using a format that is called InfiniBand, and Mellanox is building the chips that do this communication. So that's a wonderful company that is doing very, very well. Orbotech, this is a company that builds testers that test those chips, and it was acquired by KLA-Tencor for $3 billion about 2 years ago. Checkpoint, I mentioned already, the firewall again, that is being used for cybersecurity. They are worth over $20 billion, but are still kept private. So that's a very amazing company. Amdocs. I guess you know the big operators like the telcos or those that provide you with, you know, media, TV, and so on and so forth. Well, they manage their customers, okay, using you know, a customer management and billing system, okay, and most of them are using the software they are using there is by Amdocs. So that's a company again that is exporting $4 or $5 billion of product. Converse are the inventors of the answering machine and some other very elaborate products, again doing very well. Another interesting model, the Zisapel, this year Zor Zisapel and his brother is Yehuda Zisapel, they established what is called an umbrella company. Namely, if you have an idea in communication or networking and you want to build a company, they tell you, don't bother, come to us, we're going to take care of you. So over the years, they built almost 150 companies. Again, out of them, only about, you know, 5 to 10% were successful, like somewhere between 5 and 10 companies, but they were extremely successful. And they still go on and nurture those young inventors and young companies as part of the Rad family. I'll skip that. Oops, sorry. Something happened. Sorry, I need to go back to my presentation. Something happened here. It's going to take me a minute. Okay, I think we're back in business. Okay. What happens here? I don't know what to tell you. Something bizarre happened. Okay, let me try again. I'll go to that slide and see what happens. Going back to this slide, which I don't know why. Okay, never mind. It's okay. Okay, I already mentioned ICQ, which did wonders back in the mid-90s. Ways we discussed. You know, in Israel, nobody leaves home without Waze. I mean, that tells him the route to take to work or to any other meeting and so on. Crime Sense were the first that did, you know, the thing that allows you to play with the computer. You know, you can play tennis, you can play football or any other game. Microsoft acquired them. Okay, voice over IP. I don't know if you remember, you know, when you were traveling 10 years ago, 20 years ago, okay, when you were trying to call home and you were talking very, very fast because every minute, you know, the clock was ticking another, you know, $5 or whatever. Today, you can talk for hours without paying a penny because people are using the internet, okay, as the medium, and it's voice over internet protocol, and it costs you nothing because it's like bits going between computers and so on. So today, and it could be Skype, it could be Zoom, it could be you know, WhatsApp. All of that, it started with Viber. They were the first that were using this protocol. This is actually not a high-tech company, but I was amazed. This company is dealing with flavors and fragrances and so on for the food industry, and was sold for $6 billion to, I think it's Coca-Cola, or no, to another, sorry, to another big food conglomerate. I don't remember which. Sorry, this one. SodaStream was bought by Pepsi for $3.2 billion. Again, this is not a high-tech company. I couldn't mention. Okay, Teva. This is an interesting one and actually a tragic one. If you go back 5 years ago, okay, Teva was the biggest company in Israel. Actually, most of the generics, okay, in the world are being sold by Teva. Unfortunately, they did some very bad management and commercial moves, okay, and lost, you know, about $50 billion $50 billion in very bad deals, and currently they are worth about, you know, about 20% of what they used to be, and had to fire a lot of people, unfortunately. I think they're still recovered. They are excellent people, but their management did very outrageous things. Sorry, oops. What happened here? Again, I don't know. Okay, I'll move on. I don't know what to tell you. Something is, okay. This is, Compugen is just an example, but the whole issue about the human genome, you know, the fact that currently today you can get, I think, for about $1,000 a map of your genes, okay, of your DNAs and so on. And I think in 2 or 3 years it's going to cost $100. So if you have a map of your genetic, you know, framework, and it's different from one person to the next, okay, then the physicians know how to fit for you the medication or the solution that suits you. This is what is called personalized medicine. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that we understand much, much better the genetics. If you go back 20 years ago, there was a company called Elsint that did imaging products. Unfortunately, they went belly up, but two big worldwide companies, Philips and General Electric, bought the two divisions they had, MRI and CT. And to this day, if you are undergoing a CT or an MRI imaging procedure, the odds are that 50% chance that the machine that you are going to be going into is going to be either in Haifa, from either Philips or from GE. So we still are the world leader in imaging. We talked about the stents of Medinol. Mazor, this is a company that was built by a professor from the Technion in the mechanics department, and it's doing wonders on spine in surgeries without, hurting the, until using that equipment, about 20% of the cases of spine surgery would be causing paralysis, namely because of, hitting the nerve system. So with that system, this goes down to almost zero. Namely, it's a very, very good system, and that was acquired by Medtronic for 1.5 billion. Rewalk, we mentioned already. We mentioned the inventor of Rewalk, which is Amit Gopher, who is by himself paralyzed from the neck down. And again, there are many hundreds of people who couldn't, walk even 1 meter, who are now walking with this extra skeletal system. This is an interesting one. Insightec, it's still not public company. What they do is they remove tumors, without opening the body. They are using focused acoustic wave in order to burn and kill the tumor without touching the tissues around it. They have about 300 systems already installed in various hospitals. Their product is approved for both ovaries and brain tumors. Given imaging, I mentioned already the capsule. I have by the way, this morning I gave a whole hour presentation just on this company, but now we don't have time for that. Neeman, that's an interesting one. Actually, it's getting a lot of attention now because of the corona virus. But, if you have a flu, okay, currently I would say that about 30% of the people who get antibiotics shouldn't get it, and about 20% of those who should get it don't get it. And they have a system that would let you know whether it's viral or bacterial within something like 5 minutes. So they already raised $135 million, and they're going to, I don't think they want to go public, but their product is going to go out sometime this year, and I believe it's a smashing success. Totally different field, the field of energy, or MAT. It was established by the Bronitsky family. What they are doing is they are translating thermal energy coming from the earth into electrical energy. Solar energy, I mean, we have about, I think, over 100 companies in Israel that deal with solar energy, all aspects of that industry, and it's doing very well. Drip irrigation, that's an area where I believe if you think about one company that saved millions of lives, okay, it's this company, because due to drip irrigation, you can use about 1/3 of the amount of water, which in arid areas is critical. And because of that, millions of farmers can get, crops that otherwise they couldn't get. That's an interesting one. Israel is #1 by far on using recycled water or desalinated water. Over 50% of the water that we are using is coming from artificial sources, namely it's not being dug from the ground, but either recycled, namely water that was wastewater going through purification, or desalinated water coming from the ocean, which is excellent. And we have, again, over 100 companies dealing with that technology, and it's being exported to many countries in the world. We're getting close to the end. The Israel airspace industry is IAI. They are the second biggest exporter with $4.5 billion. They do everything from airplanes to missiles to many, many other sophisticated equipment. Elbit, this is, again, military industry. They do a lot of products that go into both aviation, into tanks, into anything to do with sophisticated technology. And Raphael, which is the last company I'm going to mention, the Armament Authority. They have, again, all sorts of very sophisticated technology for military. and the claim to fame is today the Iron Dome, which I put aside now any ramifications it had lately, but the technological accomplishment of that system are mind-blowing. You know, if a missile is being fired at a village or at a town, the system has 5 seconds to decide if that missile is going to land in a populated area or in a vacated area. If it's a vacated area, you don't want to waste a missile on it. If it is in a populated area, you fire a missile at it, and within 10 seconds, it needs to intercept it and prevent it from causing damage. Now, doing that with over 90% success rate is, in my mind, is mind-blowing. And that's what they accomplish. So putting aside all the political and military aspects, from a pure scientific and engineering aspect, it is a very, very impressive system. And that's all, folks. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was fabulous.
Rafi, thank you so much. You gave us a 2 or 3 credit college education here on Israel sociology and technology and future.
My pleasure.
Would you be interested?
Thank you so much.
Would you be interested in continuing your lecture at another time?
This lecture, I pretty much exhausted it. I could give you a lecture on the given imaging system, the given imaging story, if you would like. This is, again, a 1-hour kind of presentation that I could do separately.
We'll talk.
Okay. We will be in touch. Yeah, we will be
Thank you.
in touch,
That was
Raphael. Thank you so much.
So much.
You're welcome.
Great.
Okay. Well, that was
Have a great day.
one. Well, thank you all, guys. Yeah, thank you for coming again. I'm so glad to see you each and every time. And next time we'll see you in the President's house, which is a masterpiece. And it's a brilliant person and brilliant structure. So, Raphael, toda rabba for taking the time. And thank you, Steve. Thank you, Ilana, and Carol, and Barry, and Valerie, and Hugo, which is not Hugo, and all of you guys. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Julia. And we have to issue Julia a fair bon voyage, because pretty soon she's getting on an airplane.
Thank you. I don't believe it's going to happen.
You imagine Julia's getting on an airplane? Nobody does that anymore, do they?
What's going on in Greece?
Yes. Very good.
It's surreal. I mean, I don't believe I'm actually going abroad. I mean, after having this lockdown for, when you were limited to 100 meters from your home and then 1,000 meters from your home, like the idea of traveling is so weird. And
well, we're going to have to think of
I feel
you.
as if it was the first time ever.
Yeah, we're going to have to get in your mind, Julia, and take the trip with you, because that's the only way we're going to get to Greece.
Yeah.
What's going on?
Right.
What's going on in
So
Greece?
you're welcome to.
Moving forward.
Well, I don't know. I will let you know. I will know better tomorrow, and I will know much better by Tuesday. So yeah, you're welcome to join me in Greece.